Okay, so today we're going to do Descartes' third meditation. For next meeting, please read meditations 4 and 5. These are a little bit shorter, so I think next class meeting we'll be able to get through meditation 4 and at least get started on meditation 5. Meditation 3 is a little bit longer and it's kind of hard to follow. Most of this stuff might be hard for you guys to follow. It's your first time taking a philosophy class, but I think the third meditation especially so. So it's going to take us a bit longer maybe to get through the third meditation. It's going to take almost all class probably. And so that's today. But again, next class, read meditations 4 and 5. Next week, so a week from today, we're going to try to finish all of the meditations. So over this next coming weekend, try to finish reading the whole thing all the way through meditation 6. And so next week, we'll be basically finishing up Descartes. And by the end of the week, next week, we should be done with Descartes and moving on to Sartre. And I'll post, well, I think the topic is already up, but I'll assign the next assignment at the end of the week next week. So the next paper will probably be due in a couple weeks, if not a little bit longer, 2.5 weeks from now, is what I'm thinking. And I've been getting a lot of emails. I'm buried in emails. I said this a little bit before class started. So if you've been emailing me and I haven't gotten back to you, I'm really sorry, but I just got flooded. I've got all this training that I have to do online for everywhere I work. And I'm trying to get caught up. I'm hoping that by the end of the day today, I'll at least get caught up with my emails. So if you emailed me a paper and you weren't able to submit it to Blackboard, I will get to it eventually. So please bear with me. Please be patient. Somebody was in the comment section was asking about comments on the papers. I did put comments on all of the essays, but I'm not really sure. I'm not a student, so I've never had to go and look for comments as a student. But I know that I typed comments in the submission itself. I think you have to open it up. You have to click on the actual file that you submitted, the Turnitin report or whatever it's called, and then you have to click on the comments section. So if anybody kind of knows maybe why she's confused, if you could either chime in or just type it, like what to do, because I'm pretty sure, they weren't that detailed comments. I got to admit, I wasn't able to. I mean, some of them, if you got a lower grade, I tended to say a little bit more because I wanted to make sure you knew why you got the grades you got. But I had to have those midterm grades in. I had this deadline to meet, so I was kind of in a hurry. I just read the papers and made a quick comment. So, if you want me to go over it some more, you can visit me during office hours and we can talk about it there. But otherwise, like I said, I'm going to hopefully have them graded certainly by the end of the week this week. So be looking forward to that. Okay, now that that's all on the table, I'd like to jump into Descartes, but I make sure that no one has any questions first. Anybody have any questions they want to ask about where we're at, where we're going? Looks like everyone's pretty clear. Cool. Okay, well here, let me get, I'm going to be using a little bit of this slideshow, a little PowerPoint assistance. I'm going to spend not too much time, but a little just as usual, recapping the story so far. So as I said at the outset, today we're going to look at the third meditation, and the title of the third meditation, at least in our translation, is Concerning God, that he exists. So we're going to go over one of Descartes' proofs for God's existence. And I think I warned you, this meditation's a bit hard to follow. It's not the most obvious, what's he doing here? It seems to get a little sidetracked, so I'll try to make it as clear as I possibly can, as best I can, and pause through it. I'm going to skip over a lot of stuff and kind of simplify the argument. Basically, that's the plan today. But we got to remind ourselves, why is he doing this? Okay, so if the goal of the third meditation is to prove God's existence, what led him to this? So let's try to remember where we're at. Okay, let me get to the slide. He's currently, by the time he finishes the second meditation, he's still operating under this evil genius hypothesis. So he hasn't been able to disprove it yet. Remember, at the end of the first meditation, he is able to pretty much doubt everything. He comes up with this hypothesis that perhaps there might be this evil genius who's deceiving him about everything, so that all his experience is absolutely false. And then when we get to the second meditation, he saves himself a little bit. He says, well, at least there's one thing I can know for certain. And even if the evil genius hypothesis is true, I know this one thing. But that's not much. He wants to get rid of this hypothesis altogether. He's going to do that, he thinks, by proving God's existence. But let's just do a little review. What is it that he says he knows for sure? There's one thing, even if he's a skeptic about everything, even if he accepts the evil genius hypothesis, there's one thing that he says it's impossible for him to doubt. He will always know that this is true, no matter what. Who remembers?
He believes in what he sees. It does not exist if it doesn't exist. It doesn't see it. So it doesn't exist if it doesn't see it.
Well, I don't know if that's a good way to put it. If you don't see it, it doesn't exist.
Like for him, I don't know.
Well, that makes it sound that you're kind of halfway there with this whole thing about existence. But the way you stated it, it almost sounds like he's an empiricist. Like, to see something means it exists. But remember, sight is not what's key to him. Thought is what's key to him. The mind is what is key to him. He's a rationalist, remember? So all knowledge is based on the mind and on reasons. Not on what you can see, but what you understand and what you know. And what's the one thing he always knows is true, no matter what? Even if there's an evil genius deceiving him about everything he sees with his eyes and his senses, what's the one thing he can never be deceived about? You're kind of halfway there, Rev, but he might doubt things. Like, he might, look, you could be, I see this bottle, I see it, but maybe it's an illusion, maybe it's a hologram. Remember, we got this evil genius. But even if that were true, what's the one thing I could never doubt? Believe it or not, the answer is actually up there on your screen. It's just nobody here knows how to speak Latin, so that probably doesn't help you much. Cogito ergo sum. Someone says his thoughts. Khalik, yeah, pretty much. I mean, he says, I think, therefore I am, in one of his other essays. He states it a little bit differently here, but the point is the same. He can't doubt that he's thinking. He can never doubt that. He exists, he's thinking. The cogito, the thinking thing, is the one thing he could never doubt. Everything else could be an illusion. This could all be a dream, could all be simulated. Everything's false. Even mathematics could be wrong. He could be confused about mathematics and be wrong about that. But even if all things are wrong, he's an absolute skeptic. He could never doubt his own existence. But that's really not enough. He wants to know more than his own existence. He wants to know that the objects out there exist and that they exist somewhat as they appear. And he wants to know that he can know other things. But he can't really proceed until he somehow defeats this evil genius hypothesis. Until then, he's pretty much committed to a pretty radical skepticism. On almost global skepticism. He's doubting everything except for his own mind. Even his body. His body might be an illusion. Just his thoughts are what are real. He doesn't want to be that much of a skeptic. He wants to believe in other things. He wants to be a rationalist. We talked a little bit more about that last class. We were going over the wax example and how I know the wax through my understanding, not through my senses. So the understanding can know things. But at this point, how do I even know there is wax? How do I know there's anything? As long as there's an evil genius hypothesis that hasn't been destroyed, then I can't really assert anything except for the fact that I exist. The only way he sees out of this is to somehow prove that God exists. Okay? He says, if I prove that God exists, that will disprove the evil genius hypothesis. Who remembers? I think I'm pretty sure we got this far last time. I think this is right where we ended class. How does proving God disprove the evil genius? What's the connection here? Why does Descartes think that proving God will disprove the existence of this deceiving evil genius thing? What's the connection?
He thinks God can only be good.
Right. That's an essential part of it, right? God has to not be a deceiver. God has to be good, and therefore he wouldn't allow this evil deception to take place. So that's where we're at now, right? This is where Descartes is at the beginning of the third meditation, and this is why he sets out to prove God's existence. And so this begins on page 24. I'm going to read the first paragraph. In the first paragraph, he doesn't really get much done. He's just sort of recapping, and you might say he's taking stock of where he's at and what he knows. And just by reading it, it becomes pretty evident that he doesn't know much, right? He's pretty much an absolute skeptic at this point. So he writes, I will now shut my eyes, stop up my ears, and withdraw all my senses. I will also blot out from my thoughts all images of corporeal things. Or rather, since the latter is hardly possible, I will regard these images as empty, false, and worthless. And as I converse with myself alone and look more deeply into myself, I will attempt to render myself gradually better known and more familiar to myself. I am a thing that thinks, that is to say, a thing that doubts, affirms, denies, understands a few things, is ignorant of many things, wills, refrains from willing, and also imagines and senses. So this is, again, kind of a recap of all he knows, and it's not much. I exist. I'm a thinking thing. I doubt. I do this. I do that. All right. What else can we know? We can't know anything until we've somehow defeated this evil genius hypothesis. And he states this as much on the next page, on page 25. Pretty close to the bottom of that very long paragraph on page 25, he says, because I have no reason for thinking there is a God who is a deceiver, and of course I do not yet sufficiently know whether there even is a God, the basis for doubting, depending as it does merely on the above hypothesis, is very tenuous and, so to speak, metaphysical. But in order to remove even this basis for doubt, I should at the first opportunity inquire whether there is a God, and if there is, whether or not he can be a deceiver. For if I'm ignorant of this, it appears I'm never capable of being completely certain about anything else. Okay, so he just sort of restates what I just said. You know, until I prove God exists and that he's not a deceiver, I've got to basically entertain this hypothesis. And I want to be clear, and I think he is clear as he can be here, he doesn't believe this. Students mix this up. I get this in papers all the time. People write sentences like, Descartes believed that there was an evil genius that was tricking him. He never believed that. He thought it's just as ridiculous as you probably think it is. But he says, I can't really disprove it, and it's possible. And so until I can somehow show it's not possible, I have to at least entertain the possibility. I can't really defeat the skeptic and know anything for certain till I do away with this silly nonsense. You know, he mentions it's a tenuous metaphysical hypothesis that he doesn't want to believe, but he doesn't feel like it's honest for him as a philosopher to just dismiss it because it just sounds ridiculous. He's got to have good solid evidence for why it's not true. And he thinks that the only way, again, is to somehow prove that God exists and that God is not a deceiver. Okay, so how's he going to do this? How does he set out to prove that God exists? Well, we get one proof. Some might argue we get two proofs in the third meditation. It depends on how you read it. I see it more as a long, drawn-out argument with a bunch of elements to it, but it's all unified. Other people might read him as giving us two, sometimes even three arguments. he certainly does come up with another proof later on. When we get to meditation 5, you'll see he brings forth another proof for God's existence. And so, we might talk about that tomorrow. But as I warned earlier, this is not the easiest thing to follow. He starts off by making these points about, or really making distinctions, distinguishing between what he calls ideas and judgments and the source of error. And a lot of this seems like sidetracking. It kind of seems like, what does this have to do with a proof for God's existence? But I promise you, bear with me, it's eventually going to come back to that. So let's look, let's see where he begins with all this. This is on the this is the very bottom of page 25, that the very last sentence. Descartes says, now, as far as ideas are concerned, if they are considered alone and in their own right, without being referred to something else, they cannot, properly speaking, be false. For whether it is a she-goat or a chimera that I'm imagining, it is no less true that I imagine the one than the other. Okay, so when Descartes is talking about what he calls ideas, there's no falsity involved in ideas. Ideas are not false. Even if I'm thinking about a she-goat, which doesn't exist, or a chimera, which doesn't, they're fictitious, they're not real, the idea itself exists. So I can think about a purple unicorn, and even though there is no such thing as a purple unicorn really, a flesh and blood purple unicorn, the idea in my head exists. Okay, so insofar as ideas are ideas, they're true. They have true existence. What about what he calls willing? My will. When I will something, I decide, or I make a decision or a choice. Or when I feel something, an affect. What about those? He says something similar, that these are also always true, that they are real, that they exist. Whether they're just in my mind or not, that doesn't matter. They still exist in some form. So he says, moreover, we need not fear that there is falsity in the will or in the affects. For although I can choose evil things, or even things that are utterly non-existent, I cannot conclude from this that it is untrue that I do choose these things. Thus there remain only judgments in which I must take care not to be mistaken. Okay, so now we get to judgments, right? Ideas can't be false insofar as they're ideas. Willing and affects, what you might call affections, emotions, feelings, those are true, but judgments, he says, that's different. When I make a judgment about something, those can either be true or false. Those can either be true or false. There only remain judgments in which I must take care not to be mistaken. Now, the principal and most frequent error to be found in judgments consists in the fact that I judge that the ideas which are in me are similar to or in conformity with certain things outside me. Obviously, if I were to consider these ideas merely as modes of my thought, and were not to refer them to anything else, they could hardly give me any subject matter for error. Okay, so just a quick review, and then I'm going to explain what. Judgments can be true or false. Judgments are the source of error. He explains what the error is, and I'm going to reread that here in a second. But quick review, right? So ideas, the way things appear in my mind, are always true. So even if the evil genius is deceiving me about everything, I'm still being deceived. I'm still having a deception. The deception is true. It's truly a deception that's truly going on. When I have a craving or a desire for something, whether I desire something good or bad, It's still an actual craving. It's an actual will. But judgments here, he says, can be true or false. And where does the falsity lie? He says the principal and most frequent error to be found in judgments consists in the fact that I judge the ideas which are in me to be similar to or in conformity with the things that are outside of me. So we look at this picture here, right? This cartoon, whatever you want to call it. We've got this person staring at a tree, and we're assuming there's a tree out there, right? So he's getting all this sensory data that's going into his eyes, and it's all being processed by his brain, and he sees the tree as a certain way. He sees it in a certain way. It appears a certain way to him. And so Descartes is saying that the error of my judgment consists in when my representation in my mind is inconsistent with or different from the thing that's out there. I don't know if I'm not sure if it was this class or if it was my earlier class. I know it was TSU. One of my students last week, they were giving an example of sometimes we make mistakes with our sight. We might see our friend walking, what we think is our friend. Someone's walking towards us, and we think it's our buddy, but they get closer, and we realize, oh, it's not that person I thought it was. So that would be an error of judgment. Our representation, the way it appears to us, does not align with, is not, how does he put it, conform to what the thing that's out there, that's external from us. Another thing, the way he uses the term idea, I think is going to be confusing for a lot of people who are reading this. He understands when he's using the word idea in this context, it's anything in the way the world appears to me. Me looking at this bottle and staring at this bottle, right? What's labeled as representation in the mind. He's calling an idea. So it's not just you picturing something in your head. That's an idea as well. But just looking at the world and seeing it a certain way, that's an idea. So when he says that the idea doesn't conform to the thing, this picture right here is, adequate, right? You got this person, he's seeing a tree, and what if it's not really a tree, but it's like a cardboard cutout of a tree, but it looks really, really real, and he's too far away to tell that it's actually a fake tree. And he goes up to it, and it's just flat, and it's cardboard or whatever, right? So he judged in error. Okay. One of the biggest philosophical conundrums, one of the biggest problems that philosophers were dealing with during the modern period, and you could argue even today, people still deal with this in philosophy, is how do I know that my representation, the way that I experience the tree, how do I know that is anything like the actual tree itself? I mean, if there's a butterfly or a mosquito or a bunch of bees buzzing around and they're all looking at the tree, aren't they going to see it completely differently? Some of those organisms don't even have color spectrum. They can't see colors. And some of them are going to see things differently, black and white, whatever. What is the actual tree like? And so bridging the gap between the things out there and the way that they appear to me, sort of building a bridge.
Down, baby. That's not even your plate.
Okay, sorry. I don't know who that is, but please mute your. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, if you got background noise, folks, please mute your microphone. I understand that you got responsibilities, etc., and sometimes you got to have things going on in the background. But if that's the case, hit mute, please. Okay, let me go back to my slideshow here. So again, this issue of how do you bridge the gap? How do you basically how do you ensure that your perceptions of things are the way things really are? And what basis do you have for making those assertions? This is an issue that philosophy has been dealing with and still deals with today, okay? And he's going to try to resolve it. In fact, you're going to get to the, by the time we get to the end of the reading, by the time we're done with the 6th meditation, he's going to show how we can know what the things out there are really like. And but at this point, he's still like, well, why do I assume that? He asked this question, why do I assume that the things that I see out there have any resemblance to the way they appear to me? Like, why do I assume that? This is on page 26 still, right in the middle, that second full paragraph. He says, here I must inquire particularly into those ideas that I believe to be derived from things existing outside me. What reason do I have for believing that these things, what reason do I have for believing that these ideas resemble those things? He's going to give 2 arguments, or 2 reasons for why we believe. Why do I believe that there's a computer in front of me? Why do I believe that I'm sitting in a chair? Why do I believe that there's a bottle of kombucha in front of me, right? Why do I think, why do I think that this thing is as it appears? 2 reasons, he says. And maybe you can think of more. I don't know. I think he's pretty much got it here. He says most of us think that this stuff is real and it exists outside of us because we were taught so by nature, he says. I seem to have been taught so by nature. And what I take him to mean by that is that I just have an instinct. I mean, does anybody have an instinct to doubt that all the things around them exist? Is that your instinct? Do you like try to walk through walls? You're like, how do I know the wall is real? How do I know that my chair is real? I might fall through it. You don't act that way. You just naturally believe that everything around you is real and solid. You just think that. So that's one reason. Right? You're taught by nature, as he puts it. Moreover, and this is the second reason, moreover, I do know from experience that these ideas do not depend upon my will, nor consequently upon myself, for I often notice them even against my will. Now, for example, whether or not I will it, I feel heat. It is for this reason that I believe this feeling or idea of heat comes to me from something other than myself, namely from the heat of the fire by which I'm sitting. Nothing is more obvious than the judgment that this thing is sending its likeness rather than something else into me. So what's he saying there? Like, I believe that this fire exists. One, because I just have an instinctual. I just do. Like, nature just makes me believe that the fire is real. But why else? What else makes him think that it's something external to him, and that whatever's out there is a lot like the way he experiences it? I see there's some action here in the chat box. So because he feels the heat, that's part of it. Yes, he feels the heat. But why does that? What is it about the way he feels it? Could he not feel the heat? Like, if he decided to, could he say, I'm not going to feel the heat. I'm going to stand really close to the fire, but I'm going to decide to not feel the heat. Is that possible? Yeah, it's impossible, right? That's what he means. He's like, I know from experience that these ideas do not depend upon my will, nor consequently upon myself, for I often notice them even against my will. Whether I want to or not, if I look here to my right, I'm going to see a bottle. If I look down, I'm going to see a book. Even if I want to see a chocolate cake. Doesn't work, right? Chocolate cake. No, I can't will myself into seeing, right? So it seems like these things don't depend on me, so they must be out there. There must be something out there that's causing me to feel heat. And whatever it is heat-like. Because I can't decide to feel cold just because I feel like it. Well, Are those good reasons? He doesn't think so. Why not? So I believe that things exist outside me because instinct. That's one reason. And then the second is, well, they don't seem to depend on me. It's something I can't control. So that's another. Are those compelling? I think they sound pretty compelling. He doesn't, though. And maybe he's got a point. What's wrong with the first one? Why, or the second, or, either one? You believe something because you have an instinct to believe it. Is that a good reason? Does that guarantee it's true?
Or maybe you believe something because it makes things easier.
What's that? He believes something because it makes him what?
It makes things easier. Like you don't have to think too
Right.
much.
Right, but not necessarily because it's true. I'm trying to. You have something in mind, maybe like an example? I think I know what you're. I think I know what you're talking about. I'm trying to think of it. Go ahead.
Like politics or something, or
Yeah.
or some kind of ideology of some kind.
Yeah. I guess I think I was thinking the same thing, but I was trying not to be too controversial. Like someone might have a view, like a political view, that it's totally oversimplistic, but it makes them feel good. Like they just it feels right.
Yeah, I think because there's a lot of basically like making some, like we talk about ideology, political viewpoints. It's like people, like you said, people like to simplify things when these things are more nuanced or more complicated. There's more details in your view or ideology, but people like to shave all that detail off and focus on this very specific point, and focusing on that point allows them to forget everything else. It's like when you dismiss somebody as, let's say you disagree with someone, so you call them a bigot. So that means because they're a bigot, everything that they say is irrelevant because you've already decreed that person is immoral or something like that.
And you think that oftentimes can be sort of an intuitive or instinctual reaction. Like it's not rational. It's just sort of like kind of a gut reaction.
It could be both.
I was gonna say I think it could be that, but it could be both, right? I think some people rationalize their way into that, and for some people it's just visceral. They're just like, oh, you like that person, then I don't like anything else you're gonna say, and it's just and it's just oversimplifying, it's completely reactive. I got a long chat thing here. Let me read what Ariana says. Wouldn't it be experiences that would cause us to believe things like you don't go around thinking walls are fake because you've never seen a fake wall? But if you live life seeing fake walls, you learn to question whether they're real. Yeah, that's a good point. Like let's say, if you grew up in Japan, you might not. You would know that walls are even less sturdy. They've got these very thin, the paper walls in the traditional Japanese houses, and if you're a Westerner going there, you might like bump into them and you completely tear the wall up. Whereas if you grew up in that culture, you'd be much more aware and not get too close to the wall. And when you're moving furniture, you wouldn't just like jerk it into the corner really quick like you do sometimes here. So yeah, that you sound a bit like an empiricist. I'm a bit of an empiricist myself, so I'm very like susceptible to your example.
There are people who take that to its literal definition. Like right now with the whole pandemic thing, which like is something to take serious. Even like despite the recovery percentage, it is more deadly and dangerous than the flu. But a lot of people don't care because it hasn't affected them yet. So unless they see it affect them, they don't care. Or like there's people who are literally like, oh, I haven't seen the Eiffel Tower with my own eyes. So how can I be sure that it exists? There's people like that too.
Right. I guess I got to admit I'm a bit like that myself because I haven't really been that much affected by COVID. I mean, I've known of people who knew people who got it. And so I think I probably don't take it as seriously as I should, but I'm aware of that. Like, I know that like I'm in ignorance about it. And I'm sure that like if it did affect me, I probably would take it a lot more serious, you know?
I mean, but that's a lot of people. It's like
Yeah.
people don't really think of. It's like when you hear someone lost their parent, and you're like, "Oh, that could happen to me," but it hasn't, so I don't think
Right.
that way. So
Yeah. Yeah. And when it does, it's like, you know, but yeah, I think though too, the idea here, he's sort of, you know, he's sort of saying, look, well, let me read. I'll read what he says here, but he's pretty much he wants to diss what he call. He doesn't use the word instinct, but I think that he's talking about instinct, um, taught by nature. And Ariana's example, I think, is pretty good because, in a way, I'm thinking, well, maybe this is something that you do gain through experience. You know, because again, if you're raised in one culture, you know, for instance, Japan, you might be more wary of walls and not trying to get into them or whatever. Whereas if you're Westerner, walls are more solid, so you don't have to be they're not as fragile or whatever. And so, you know, if you grow up in Japan or you grow up in America, you might think of these as just as instinctual, and you think of them as something that's a part of your nature, when in reality they were actually conditioned, that you actually learned them. So that's I think it's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know if we should think about too much because we might get sidetracked. But you're also, both of you, I think, not just I forgot who's the last one talking. Was it Michael or Itza? But yeah, you bring up this interesting point about skeptics. Like, you know, can you really be a skeptic? If you're going to be a skeptic, and I think Ariana says something like this, you know, people don't go around thinking walls are fake. Yeah, it's sort of like nobody lives this way. You know, it's not practical. And Descartes knows that. He's not going to live the life of a skeptic. He's not really going to doubt everything. But he feels compelled to prove the skeptic wrong somehow with a knock-dead philosophical argument. And so he thinks, you know, I'm going to prove that this whole skeptical, I'm going to doubt everything. You know, your example of the Eiffel Tower is a good one, right? You can't prove it. Maybe it's all fake. Never been there myself. I don't know. I mean, and no one can live this way. I mean, maybe there's legends about what's his name, Pyro or Firo. I'm never sure if I correctly pronounce his name, so I'll just spell it. But Philo was this ancient Greek skeptic who apparently was so skeptical, he said anything could be an illusion, that his followers had to follow him around and push him out of the way if some like dangerous boulder was coming towards him, or, you know, some horse chariot was coming his way and about to run him over. They have to push him out of the way because he's like, I don't know, maybe I'll die, maybe I won't. You know, those are probably made up though. You know, if anybody actually lived their life doubting everything, probably wouldn't work. But is that good enough reason to believe it? He doesn't think so. You know, even if we're taught so by nature, even if it's an instinct, sometimes we have an instinct to do things that are wrong and bad. So for him, that's not a good enough argument. That's not good enough to believe that these things do exist. You know, he does believe they exist. He's going to get there, but he doesn't think these are good reasons. So he says, when I say that I've been taught so by nature, all I have in mind is that I'm driven by a spontaneous impulse to believe this. So that's why I think it's instinct, a spontaneous impulse is what he's talking about. And not that some light of nature is showing me that it is true. Now, this is a distinction that he makes that I really don't like. He distinguishes between being taught by nature and being shown by the light of nature. And as far as I can tell, he does not really explain the difference, at least to in a satisfactory way. And I think that it doesn't matter so much here, because I think his argument still holds. Because all he's saying is, okay, I have an instinct, I have an impulse to believe that the things out there are real. But just because I have an impulse doesn't prove anything. I have an impulse to want to eat a chocolate cake, but I know that that's not good for me. So just because an impulse is there doesn't mean it's correct. But this whole distinction between being taught by nature and being shown by some light of nature to be true, I'm going to call BS on this. You know, I don't see the difference. He tries to make a distinction, and let me read the rest of this passage, and I'll try to unpack it and do as good I can to help him out. But I really don't think I don't think he's being fair, honestly. I think he's sort of, if he likes something and he thinks it's certain and true, that's been shown by the light of nature. If it's something to dismiss, it's been taught by nature, right? It's instinctual, you know. To me, it's a distinction without much of a difference. But let's read how he says it here. I'll start over again. He says, when I say I've been taught by nature, all I have in mind is that I'm driven by a spontaneous impulse to believe this, not that some light of nature is showing me it to be true. These are two very different things. For whatever is shown me by this light of nature, for example, the fact that I doubt, from the fact that I doubt follows that I am, and the like, cannot in any way be doubtful. This is owing to the fact that there can be no other faculty that I can trust as much as this light, and which could teach that these things are not true. But as far as natural impulses are concerned, in the past I have often judged myself to have been driven by them to make the poorer choice when it was a question of choosing a good, and I fail to see why I should place any greater faith in them than in other matters. Okay, so yeah, my instincts sometimes fail me. So if I believe in things outside me because of some instinct, that's not a solid argument. My instincts could deceive me. They could lead me astray. But just to back up a bit, right? Again, this distinction between being taught by nature, an impulse, and being shown by the light of nature, I don't think he explains it very well. I have a feeling that if he was pushed to explain it, what he would say is something like this. He would say, all these things I've been taught by nature, these are things that I've gotten through my interactions with the world, through my body, through physics, through what you might call experience. These are things I learn through my interactions. Whereas things that are shown to me by the light of nature are things that I simply know by thinking about them. All it requires is my mind and nothing else. So it's just self-evident. One has to just reason about it, think about it, and you become aware it's true. And he thinks that, you know, the fact that he exists is one of those things. I think, therefore I am. That is shown to me by the light of nature. It is evident, self-evident truth. Again, this is pretty controversial, and I don't like this because it seems like it's this sort of get out of jail free card. Anytime he wants to assert something as certain, he'll just say, oh, it's shown to me by the light of nature, and I can't doubt it. It's undoubtable. Okay, so we've seen him attack the instincts. He says, well, if I believe in all these things out there because I'm just have an instinct or an impulse to do it, that's not enough. My impulses can sometimes lead me astray. But what about the other argument? What about the fact that I don't control what I see? I can't decide to look out the window and see a purple unicorn. You know, I'm gonna look outside the window and I see a bunch of cars driving by on the busy road out in front of my house. You know, and whether I want to see them or not, I'm going to see them if I look. So is that a good argument? They don't depend on me, it seems. I can't will them. He doesn't seem to think that that is a good enough argument. Okay. He says, and this is on page 27, the second paragraph, he says, although these ideas do not depend upon my will, it does not follow that they necessarily proceed from things that exist outside me. For just as these impulses about which I spoke just now seem to be different from my will, even though they're in me, so too perhaps there is also in me some other faculty, one that is not yet sufficiently known to me, which produces these ideas. Just as it has always seemed up to now that ideas are formed in me without any help from external things when I'm asleep. So what's he saying here? He says, well, I don't cause, when I look at the bottle, I don't say, make me see a bottle. Like, I want to see it. No, I look and it's there. So it doesn't seem to be under my control, what I see. Why is that not enough argument? Why, for him, what is he saying here? Why is that not compelling enough to prove that I'm not the cause of these ideas? That the ideas, if I'm this guy right here looking at this tree, I'm having an experience of the tree. There's this representation in my mind, as that little label says. How do I know, that it's not coming from my own mind? Why do I assume it's from something out there? Just because I don't control what I see? He says that's not a good enough reason. Why not? I just read it again. You could go ahead? Yeah.
Well, I think it's okay. So remember, I brought up how it's easier to believe in something else, and it makes the rather than think about it more complicated. It's similar to how he is assuming that God is good. So when I take that to religions, like people, and this isn't everybody, but there's a lot of people who enjoy religion, or there's some people who enjoy religion because it's easier to point to that and erase all responsibility from them. So it's like, if things are good, it's not because I'm good, or if things are bad, it's because there's some kind of path forward that I have to take that is that's not from me. Like, so maybe he's just thinking like, it can't be me. It can't. It has to be something else.
Well, he hasn't. I mean, he wants to believe that, okay? Because I think he wants to believe it because it would sound kind of absurd to most people if you were a philosopher that went around saying everything in the whole world. I mean, I guess Plato did that, and we still like him, but he was like the first, But you went around telling people that everything in the entire world is all made up. It's all an illusion, and everything is just ideas in your mind, and there's nothing external to your mind. That's pretty rare in the history of philosophy. You've got Plato, you got maybe Berkeley. There's a few philosophers, but most of them want to. Even Descartes, the uber rationalist, is eventually going to say physical objects exist. They exist, and they're out there, and they don't depend on me. But at this point, he's saying the standard arguments don't work. The standard argument that it's just the natural impulse, that won't work. And the standard argument that it doesn't depend on my will. I look up and I see the ceiling. I look down, I see the floor. I don't decide to see the ceiling. I don't decide. It's going to be there whether I decide to or not. But that's not enough.
I guess
Go ahead.
I would say I guess I viewed it as more of a mental thing rather than him just looking at it like, okay, no, that's actually there. There's
Well, it kind of is at this point. It kind of is a mental thing. He wants to get back to having a physical world. But at this point, he's like, I'm stuck in my mind. I am mental, kind of, and I want to get out of that. He's going to eventually, right? He's going to prove God exists, and then through that proof, he thinks he can somehow prove that physical things exist, and they exist somewhat as they appear. Not always. There's sometimes our senses are a little off, but more or less, and we can use reason to get at the actual truth of things. But at this point, he doesn't have a good reason for believing it, because he says, well, just because something doesn't depend on my will doesn't mean it didn't come from me. And it's kind of reminds me what you were saying earlier about ideology, religion, whatever. People, and I don't know if I completely get your point, so correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of you're saying, so people will often use religion or religious ideas as excuses. Things don't work out for them, or things do work out for them. Either way, they'll point to some external cause that helps them feel better about themselves, et cetera, that kind of thing. But he's saying, look, for all I know, my belief in the external world could be one of those things. That I'm delusional about, that as he puts it here, even though he says even though these impulses which I just spoke about seem to be different from my will, they are in me. Okay, so even though, like he talks about, I have an impulse to want to eat that chocolate cake. I didn't decide to want to eat that chocolate cake. I just looked at it and it looked freaking good, and it like I was drawn towards it. And then my will came in and said, don't do that, Travis. You need to be good with your diet. You know, you've been really good so far this week. You don't get a cheat meal for another few days, you know? So he says, so that impulse, that desire to eat the chocolate cake came from me, kind of. It was in me, but not me. Yeah, go ahead.
That sounds like, isn't that like, I don't know if I'm saying the terminology right, but it sounds like the id and the ego, like.
Yeah, this is before all that. You know, maybe he is somewhat thinking about like Plato, because Plato talked about the soul having parts, and it's very much like Freud's theory of the id and the superego and the ego. Because for Plato, you've got the soul can be compared to like a chariot with two horses, and the one guy is controlling these two horses, and I guess the id is the bad horse, right? The horse that's always wanting food and pleasure and things. And then the other horse is, I guess, the ego, because he's like all noble and wants to be a good person and wants other people to think he's good. And then there's just the rational charioteer, the mind, you know, who just sees and tries to control all these impulses. So maybe Descartes is kind of thinking about Plato, right? That, okay, so just because I don't have any control over whether or not I see that tree out there, that doesn't mean that it's not just in my mind. Maybe, as he puts it, perhaps there's in me some other faculty, one that's not even known to me, which produces these ideas. So maybe I don't even know it, but I'm producing these ideas. And he says, doesn't this happen to me when I'm sleeping? Don't we all have dreams?
Yeah.
And we have dreams, they're images, they're representations in our mind, and they're not being caused by anything external. You know, there's no objects. We're not looking at objects. We're just in our head having dreams. And we don't control them, they come to us. And so they're in us. So he says, hey, just because I don't control what I see when I look around doesn't mean that I'm not the one producing all this stuff. So he's like, man, I'm screwed. I don't even know if things out there exist. And even if they do, this is like the last point. He says, finally, even if these ideas did proceed from things other than myself, it does not therefore follow that they must resemble these things. Again, that's the big question for modern philosophy. You could argue even today, philosophers argue about this. How do I know what the actual thing is like? How do I know what this object is really like? All I have is my view of it. How do I know that my view is correct? You know, if there's a bumblebee flying around or a butterfly or some insect and it's looking at the tree, it's going to see it different. It's going to be represented different for that insect. So how do I know what the real tree is like? He says, indeed, it seems I have frequently noticed a vast difference in many respects. For example, I find within myself two distinct ideas of the sun. One is drawn, as it were, from the senses. Now it is this idea, which of all those I take to be derived from outside me, that is most in need of examination. By means of this idea, the sun appears to me to be quite small. But there's another idea, one derived from astronomical reasoning, that is, it is elicited from certain notions that are innate in me, or else is fashioned by me in some other way. And through this idea, the sun is shown to be several times larger than the earth. Both ideas surely cannot resemble the same sun existing outside me, and reason convinces me that the idea that seems to have emanated from the sun itself, from so close, is the very one that resembles the sun. So, you know, he's giving this example, right? I look at the sun, and don't do this, by the way. Don't look at the sun. It's not good for your eyesight. But they didn't know any better in the 1600s, right? So if you look at the sun, you know, you got one idea of the sun where you're seeing it and it's small. It looks small. You're like, well, if I look at it from where I'm standing, it doesn't look that big. But then if you use astronomical reasoning, as he puts it, you realize that the sun is actually really far away. This may seem like a bit of a straw man argument against the empiricists. Remember, the empiricists are the ones that think that all knowledge is based on experience and through the senses and the emotions, things we've directly experienced. And Descartes' a rationalist. All our knowledge comes from reason. And so this might seem like a bit of a straw man argument against the empiricist. I mean, do you really look at the sky and think that the sun is only that big? You know it's far away. I mean, you know it's bigger than it appears, don't you? You don't have to like use charts and math to figure that out. I think it's just common. You have depth perception. But to be fair to Descartes, if you went to some farmer in 1650 and told him that the sun was bigger than the earth, he probably would believe you. I mean, he would know it's big. He knows it's far away, but he's like, but it can't be bigger than the earth, right? And it's just, like they wouldn't get it, because it just seems so close. It seems so hot, and like it's big, but it's not that big. And so he's saying, look, you've got these two representations. They don't fit. One of them is correct. One of them actually applies to the actual sun, and that's the one that tells me it is bigger than the earth. And the other one I get from just observation, and that's mistaken. So my representations, my ideas, are not always in line with the actual things. How do I make sure they are? Well, we don't ever really get an answer for that till the very end of the meditations. Right now, we still have to prove that God exists. And now you might be thinking, like, when are we going to do that? Like, I thought you said he's going to prove God exists. What the heck? When is this going to come up? Well, we finally get to it now at the bottom of page 27. Finally starts to begin his argument for God's existence. He says, this is the last paragraph on page 27. He says, still another way occurs to me for inquiring whether some of the things which there are ideas in me, some of the things of which there are ideas in me do exist outside me. Insofar as these ideas are merely modes of thought, I see no inequality among them. They all seem to proceed from me in the same manner. Okay, so what he's saying here at the outset, he says, when I'm looking at ideas, okay, an idea, and remember what he meant by that. Anything that is represented in my mind, whether it's something out there that I'm seeing, whether it's a thought in my head and just in my head, irregardless, those are all ideas. And what he's saying is, insofar as they're ideas, they're all the same. They're all ideas. They're all on equal footing. However, he says, insofar as one idea represents one thing and another idea another thing, it is obvious that they do differ very greatly from one another. Okay, so obviously the idea of a purple unicorn is not the same as an idea of a triangle. They're different ideas. Okay, so far what he said is pretty obvious and redundant, and you might be wondering, where's he going with all these points? Now you're going to get to it. He's going to say, unquestionably, those ideas that display substances to me are something more, and if I may say so, contain within themselves more objective reality than those which represent only modes or accidents. Okay, what is he saying there? Okay, ideas that display substances are something more and contain within themselves more objective reality than those that represent modes or accidents. Okay, what does he mean by an idea displaying substance? This is not very clear, and I don't think he makes it clear. Maybe I'm wrong and I'm missing something here. If you have an idea, jump on in. But this word substance, it's a word that has a long history in philosophy, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different philosophers. So he's being very vague by talking about ideas that display substances versus ideas that are, what does he say, represent only modes or accidents. So I suppose like a purple isosceles triangle, if I have an idea of a purple isosceles triangle, that displays modes and accidents, okay? You don't have to be purple to be a triangle. You don't have to be isosceles to be a triangle. That's a mode or an accident. That's something that's not essential to triangle, okay? So that's an idea that doesn't display substance, but displays also substance and modes or accidents. So the idea of a triangle just talks about the triangle, and that's substance. That's just a thing that's clearly defined. There's only one type of thing that's a triangle. Only one thing answers to that definition, the concept of triangle. So he's going to say that the idea of God displays more substance than other ideas. Okay, the idea of God does not include modes or accidents. The idea of God only talks about what is essential of God. And so what does he mean by God? He gives, you got to give him credit for this. He does give us a definition. It's a pretty, basic definition, but he gives us a definition for what he means by God. And he thinks, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, I'll leave that up to you, but he thinks he can prove that God exists just on the basis that the idea of God exists. He thinks that's not controversial. No one would argue that the idea of God doesn't exist. Even if you're atheist, even if you don't believe that God does exist, you believe the idea exists. That's why I have, here on the slideshow, God is in quotation marks, right? Descartes is going to start with the concept, the idea of God, and show that the fact that that concept exists will lead us to a proof that the actual deity exists. Was somebody going to jump in? I think I heard a mic open. No? Okay. So he says, unquestionably, and I'm just rereading the same sentence I left off on. He says, unquestionably, those ideas that display substances, to me, are something more, and if I may say so, contain within themselves more objective reality than those which represent only modes or accidents. Again, the idea that enables me to understand a supreme deity, eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, and creator of all things other than himself has more objective reality within it than do those ideas through which finite substances are displayed. So apparently the idea of God has more objective reality than the idea of a triangle, because a triangle is finite, God is infinite. This is another term that I need to explain a bit. He keeps using the phrase objective reality, objective reality. And this he distinguishes from formal or actual reality. So when he's talking about objective reality, he means it exists as an idea. It exists as an object to a subject, as to a mind. So the idea of God, any idea, the idea of a purple unicorn, the idea of a triangle, insofar as they are ideas, they exist. They exist. And so they have objective reality. Now he's trying to figure out, okay, so obviously this idea of God has objective reality, but does it correspond to something actual? Does it correspond to an actual deity? Okay. So that's the big question. He thinks he can get there, okay, just by contemplating the idea itself. Now, somebody in the chat box, Danielle, said she got the 4th edition of Descartes. I don't think that's going to make a difference. I really don't. You might have different page numbers, so I'm real sorry. You're going to have to deal with the different page numbers. Other than that, it should be about the same. So if it's 4th edition. Somebody's about to jump in with a question. Go ahead.
I was gonna say that sounds kind of like an ideal. Like he's like because it sounds a lot like Plato again. It's like because we have an idea of a concept, that must mean there's some perfect version of that concept that somehow we have knowledge of, and because we have knowledge of that concept, that means that ideal form exists somewhere beyond our perception. But I just find it weird because, like, if you've only seen finite things, then what do you like? What does infinite look to you? I mean, the closest could be the ocean, because we they couldn't explore it like we can now.
Or space.
And even now we haven't explored space or space. But even then, they view those things as finite.
Yeah,
But,
the Greeks did.
So it's weird. It's like, how do you view something that you have not explored all of finite, but then conclude that because you believe that the concept of a infinite objective, an infinite omniscient deity exists is proof of some ideal form of that concept.
Yeah.
You know, it just
Right.
it feels like he's trying to ask something without also trying to come off as impietous.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's definitely part of it. You know, he doesn't, I think he honestly doesn't want to do this. He'd rather go back to doing physics and math, but he feels like obligated to do this. And maybe that's why some people think his arguments are pretty weak, because he's just kind of like, but you're right to point out the parallels with Plato. I think you're absolutely right. And it's a similar mode of thinking. I think it really is. It's sort of like, I have this idea of perfection, that it must correspond to something. So therefore, there must be something that is perfect, right? I mean, I'm skipping a lot of steps, but that's kind of how you put it, and that kind of sums it up. But we are skipping a few steps, so let me try to help him out a little bit and give his argument a little bit more teeth. But I notice there's a pretty good comment here from Khalik. He says, it's like your mother tells you don't have a dad, but deep down you know you just didn't come from a woman. Yeah, exactly. Okay, that's actually part of his argument too. Okay, and so let me pause. And I'm going to read this next little line here because it ties into what Khalik just said, and also a little bit of what you just said, Michael. So he says, and here it is again, the light of nature showing him the way. You know, this sounds idealistic, you know, sort of wishful thinking, but he says, it is indeed evident by the light of nature that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as there is in the effect of the same cause. For whence, I ask, could an effect get its reality if not from its cause? And how could the cause give that reality to the effect unless it also possessed that reality? Hence, it follows that something cannot come into being out of nothing, and also that what is more perfect, that is, what contains in itself more reality, cannot come into being from what is less perfect. Okay, so what he's doing there in that quote, and it's not the clearest way to put it, but he's basically restating what's known as the principle of sufficient reason, and he's adding a little bit to it, which I think he's getting from Plato also, by the way. Since you mentioned Plato, I might as well, you know, mention him again, because I think he's doing something with this principle that not every philosopher would agree with. So let me explain the principle to you. I think I can do it better than he just did. But the principle of sufficient reason, basically what it says is that everything that is, everything that exists, was caused. It was brought about by something, okay? And whatever brought it about, whatever caused it, whatever the reason is, must have been sufficient. What does that mean, though? What does the word sufficient mean? Who's familiar with the word sufficient? If I say something sufficient, what does that mean? No one's familiar with the term sufficient? That's a sufficient amount of, it's enough. Good, Brianna's got it. Yeah, it's just enough. So this is a pretty basic principle, and most philosophers, if not all of them, they agree to it more or less, right? That, yeah, everything that exists was caused, and whatever caused it had to be enough to cause it. If I have a 40-pound ball of wax, I need at least 40 pounds of wax to make it. If that's what I'm trying to make, I need a sufficient amount of stuff. And if it's going to be wax, I have to have wax. I can't use Jell-O. I can't use straw. I can't use iron. So whatever made the thing had to be enough to make the thing. Now, here's the part I think that is sort of the Descartes remix. You know, this is like the Cartesian remix of the original principle. Descartes adds to this, and I think this is coming from a sort of Plato way of thinking. He says, whatever created the thing must be better and more perfect than the thing. So this is where I kind of want to push back on him, and maybe you do as well. I mean, he's asserting that whatever created you must be better than you or more perfect than you. Whatever created anything has to be better and more perfect than that thing. I mean, I can see that this has somewhat of a kind of an appeal to it, because you're like, well, it's powerful. It was able to create something, you know, so it must be better than the thing it created. It's superior to that thing. But can you think of how some problems with that line of thinking?
It depends. Like, what do you mean by better? Is it like, are
Oh
you
yeah,
talking about a specific thing? Because if you made a computer to calculate things, that
right,
thing calculates things faster and better, more accurately than a person.
right.
It sounds like hubris. Like, it sounds like he's attributing a hubris to something that, of course, because you created something or because you put something in some place in a position that you're better than
Right.
that whatever it is,
And
which in my opinion it kind of like defeats the purpose of an objective reality. That is, if his God is objective reality, why attribute that kind of hubris? Because objectivity is without bias. Like a computer would be objective. It's if that's what he's going. If
right. Yeah,
based
I
on the
mean, I like your example. I think maybe the way he would defend himself against the computer example, he would say, and that's funny because I used the same example in the previous class because people were having trouble, and I came up with that one myself too. So we were thinking alike. But I would think like Descartes might defend us against our objection with the computer. He might say, well, the computer doesn't know how to calculate. Like you built it to calculate, but it doesn't do calculations. Like it just like automatically does things that it was programmed to do. So you are superior to the computer at calculation. Like it's able to do math. Like it's able to spit out numbers that are accurate, you know. But I would say like, man, you're just bending definitions, dude. Like, come on. Like, and also too, and this is where I kind of thought you were going with this was like, how do we know what's best? Best at what? Like maybe maybe the computer is better at surviving in freezing temperatures. You know, like
I was also gonna say that maybe it's just that specific creator. Because are you saying like humans? Or is he saying humans?
Right. Yeah,
Because there could be a person who just puts numbers in a calculator, doesn't know what it does, like, and then they get the answer and they put it down. Is that human superior? Just because it was made to calculate, it was made to calculate in ways that like a lot of people can't.
Yeah, I think that's what he would say, or he'd want to say that, you know, and so whatever made the thing must be better than the thing. And I like that you brought up people because like that's a good example. You know, you could argue that sometimes if you want to say that you were created by your parents, or you know that your parents created you. I mean, you might say, well, I was created by if you're religious, you might say God created me. Yeah, but you know what I mean, right? Like, isn't it possible that like good parents have bad kids? Or bad parents have good kids sometimes. Like it's possible. So I think this idea that like whatever creates something must be superior to it is just false. But Khalik's last comment he says a human had to come from something or someone. We just didn't pop up on the earth, basically. Yeah, you actually, Khalik, you're reminding me there is, I guess, more than one argument in the third meditation. I'm kind of covering the main argument, but part of it is he's like, well, something had to create me. And this ties into the principle of sufficient reason because he says, well, I'm a thinking thing, so whatever created me must be a thinking thing as well. And it must be a better thinking thing. You know, it has to be better than me at thinking. So if only thought can create thought. And so that's something, if you're like a biologist or a neuroscientist, you might think is quite humorous. You know, no, thought is created by, you know, neurons firing in your brain. It's a biological process. And are you saying that brains are better than thoughts? I mean, this is absurd. This is, you know, probably what they would say. But yeah, he kind of comes up with this first cause argument. There had to be, let's just say my parents caused me. Okay, well, what caused them? And what caused them? And it's going to keep going. Eventually, there had to be a first cause, a first creator. And so he does provide a sort of first cause argument. But I honestly think most of the third meditation is trying to establish, it's different than that. It's different than, it's sort of like, well, what caused the idea of God? Where did the idea come from? We don't doubt the idea exists. We all believe the idea exists. Some of us don't believe that there is a God. Some do. But we all believe the idea exists. So how do we get from the idea to the actual deity? He thinks all you have to do is reflect on the origin of the idea. Where did it come from? And he says, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think the problem. Okay, so I'm even though I've made arguments like saying like this is why people like religion and stuff like. I'm not really. I'm not agnostic or atheist. I'm more. I guess I'm a deist.
Yeah.
But like I think there's something out there. But I'm also like I don't think that whatever is out there can be easy. Like because people like he's saying there's a deity. Like why are you just attributing some kind of personification to whatever the creator might be? Like what if it's just something that is? So like when you keep saying there's a creator that has to be this, that specifically did this, that specifically did that, I'm like, or things just happen. Like or that whatever that deity is, whatever that being or abstract, you know, like omniscience is, simply did things and we are just a byproduct of that. And
Well,
people
I think, and then in a way, that's sort of like, we only got like 5 minutes left, so I'm trying to like get things wrapped up here. But I think I see where you're going, and honestly, I think to be fair to Descartes, I think he tries to be as conservative as possible about his definition of God. But even then, because he's that conservative, I think it makes his argument fail. Because he's like, well, what do I mean by God? All I mean is infinite, perfect, creator of all things. You know, we saw the list, right? And then he says, well, just like, you know, the principle of sufficient reason tells us, everything that exists has to have a cause. So this idea of God that's in my mind has to have a cause. And so, you know, what caused it? Was it my senses? And he doesn't think it could be my senses, because he's like, your senses, like, when have you seen God? Like, how, you know, what did he look like? You know, what did he smell like? What did he taste like? You know, you didn't get to this notion through your senses. And then he asks, well, could I have arrived at this idea of God through my own thoughts, through myself? And he says, there's no way, right? And why not?
it's not just that, because this rabbit hole that he's willingly put a walking into, if he says there has to be an inception for everything, then isn't there an inception of God? Like something like in the inception of the inception of the inception of God. It's like if there's an origin point of everything,
right?
If something comes from something, regardless of like what it is, as far as, and there's infinite possibilities as far outside of our perception, then there could be infinite creators. Or this could just be this could be any number of different universes after something else.
Yeah, again, this is another thing too. I'm glad you brought that up, but it's a whole other problem. He's also relying on this argument that goes back to Aristotle, that you can't have an infinite regress. Okay, I'm going to write that term in the chat box, infinite regress. So you can't, like you said, you're like, okay, and he does this for a while. He's like, well, maybe the idea of God was caused by another idea that was an even more godlike idea, and that idea was caused by another idea that was godlike, and that idea was caused by but he's like, but eventually, like, there had to be a first one that was just self-sufficient. And it seems like you're saying, does there? Like, why? And I'm kind of the same way. Like, maybe it does go back to infinity. You know, you're just limiting yourself to what you can conceive. And so, I don't know. You know, I think, I'm not sure I follow him or I agree with him on that whole thing. But I mean, we're like 2 minutes to go. So let me get the argument on the table. We're probably gonna have to recap this a little bit next class because I'm going through it so fast. But, you know, real quick, where does the idea of God come from? He says, it could not have come from my senses. I've never sensed this perfect, eternal. You don't see infinity. You don't see eternity. You don't see with your senses. And I couldn't have got it from myself, he says, for many reasons. But one striking one is that I'm not infinite. I'm finite. And so if I'm finite and I'm not perfect, how is it that I have a conception of infinity? How is it that I have a conception of perfection? I have these ideas, and they couldn't have come from my senses, and they couldn't have come from myself. They must have come from something that was sufficient, something that was enough, and the only thing that is sufficient would be something that's perfect and infinite, and that's God. So God must exist, or else I wouldn't have an idea of God. This is known, he calls this the mark of the craftsman. And this argument is known as the mark of the craftsman argument. So God put a mark on our minds, on our soul, just like a craftsman when he makes a piece of iron or something, he'll stamp the logo on it. When your clothes have made in Japan or made wherever, China, made by God. That's what it is. That's basically what that idea is telling you. That there's no way you could have come up with the notion of infinity unless God placed that there. And
I just find that weird because he says I doubt that I think therefore I am, because he doubts. And you can doubt about an infinite. You can doubt. He doubts everything except that, and because he doubts that, he doesn't doubt the existence of a God, or at least like a Christian God.
It's because he has the idea. It's because he has the idea that, and he can't explain where it comes from. Of course, you have arguments against this, like David Hume, the empiricist, says. Of course, you can get this idea from yourself. All you have to do is think about wisdom, goodness. You've had experience of wisdom and goodness, and just imagine a being that had all those qualities and never had faults. And he's like, there's nothing special about that. And one thing that I think that is weak about his argument, and this kind of comes into something I think somebody was saying earlier, I don't know if it was you, Michael, or Ita, but somebody was saying how God is this really vague notion, and it's not like we really have a clear idea of God. It's a very vague, very abstract. In fact, that's not blasphemous, that's not disrespectful or blasphemous to say it. Most religious people who are very devout will say this, that God is mysterious, that God is beyond our understanding, beyond our contemplation. God's ways are mysterious, and our human mind can't grasp all of God's beauty and wisdom and all this stuff. And if that's the case, then it's not really that crazy that he has a vague. I mean, if he totally understood God, if he understood an infinite perfect being, clearly understood all his ways, that would be kind of crazy and need explanation. That'd be like, dude, how did I know that? I'm not God and I know about God? But I think
we have popes, and there was pharaohs back in the days.
I guess so, right? Yeah. So, and I think also too that reminds me of something I think you said earlier. Somebody said earlier. I think too he's treading on thin ice here, so he's very careful about what he says. He doesn't want to upset the church like some of the other philosophers did during this time period. But we're already over for time, folks. I'm sorry I was rambling today, but I felt like we had a pretty good meeting, even though it's a very confusing reading. Hopefully I made it as clear as I could. Let's see. We get a grasp of his goodness through the Bible. That was good as through the. Okay, still, again, that's a very specific. Descartes' a Christian, but he doesn't want to rely on the Bible because, again, that is people who heard testimony, who said they saw God directly, etc. And for him, he's like, again, he's trying to rely only on his own mind and only on what he can know for certain. And so until he can somehow get out of the skepticism, he can't even go to the good book, as they say, right? He's kind of stuck.
It was a commission book too. That's the King, isn't it? The King James.
Yeah. He's probably reading. Yeah, by then I don't know if it was the King James he was reading, though, in 1650. I mean, that's a British version, right? But I'm sure there was a French equivalent. No, you know what? I think France was still a part of the church. Yeah, like the papacy was still. They weren't a part of the Protestant breakaway, right? That was England and Germany and all the Bavarian countries. Yeah. So he's still operating under the Pope. You're right. Yeah, so he's still sort of the organized ecclesiastical effort. But yeah, he's trying to be real scientific and not base anything on faith. It's all just reason. So he can't say, well, the Bible says it, so it's good. That's not enough. He's got to give a philosophical argument. All right, good comments, good participation today. I had fun. So if you want to stick around, I'll stick around too. If I know a few of you guys have been trying to get in touch with me, and I've been super busy and not responsive. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.